everyone, it's Wei. Welcome back. Today I am doing a video for watercolor beginners. I know this is probably a long time coming video because it's been mentioned by a number of people already. So I decided to make a video to talk to you about some of the basic materials and tools that you're going to need. And I'll also show you a couple of beginners watercolor techniques, and at the end of this video I am going to do a demonstration painting to show you how and where you can use those techniques. The first thing you'll need is, of course, watercolor paint. I know that some people have bought or are considering maybe buying the supermarket brand at some point because it's easy access and usually very cheap. I have also bought a watercolor set from my local supermarket, Auchan, because I was curious to see what they look like on paper, and the result is, of course, very terrible. It's not what watercolor is supposed to look like on paper. There might be better ones, but in general I wouldn't recommend the supermarket brand, however cheap they might be, because the quality is so bad that you're just going to get very frustrated with it. But if you already have one, then that's fine. I don't think you need to throw it out. You can still use it for simple coloring or decoration. There are basically two types of watercolor paints, the student's quality paint and the artist's quality paint. I think most major brands make both the student's quality and the artist's quality paints. Generally speaking, the artist's quality is more vibrant and concentrated in pigment and lasts longer, meaning that the colors are resistant to light and humidity and won't fade over time. However, I do not believe there's a huge difference between these two for beginners, or at least it's not the most important thing in the beginning. For example, I started out painting with this Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolor box. Cotman is the student's quality paint of Winsor & Newton. And when I finished one of the colors, I think it was Cobalt Blue, I went down to the art shop and picked up a replacement pen for it. But what I didn't know was that the new pen that I picked up was actually an artist quality paint. So I went back home and replaced it and started using the colors, and I didn't even see the difference. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that in the beginning, the difference is really not that noticeable for beginners. And there are many beautiful paintings that are done with the students' quality paints. The good thing is that they are on the less expensive side, so I think it's a good idea to start with them. And later down the road, if you feel like a more experienced painter, you can also choose to try the artist quality paints to see for yourself if you can feel the difference. And of course, if you're satisfied with the student's quality paints, I think it's totally okay to stick with them. I myself use partially students' quality paints like Winsor & Newton Cotman, Van Gogh, and another paint that's called Le Franc et Bourgeois, which I can't find for the moment. And I use artist quality paints as well, such as Sennelier and my recently purchased Lucas. As for brands, I haven't tried a lot. As you probably noticed that I don't have a lot of brands here because I don't usually care too much about brands as long as it's a professional and well-known brand. I do get curious sometimes about colors from other brands and wonder if certain colors might perform better, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. So here is a list of some popular brands that you might find in art shops. Depending on the country or region you live in, you might find some of these brands but not the others. It doesn't matter. I would suggest that you just go to your local art supply store and see what's available there. Watercolor paints mainly come in two forms, pens and tubes. This is more like a personal preference, I would say. I prefer to use pens because it's smaller in size and easier to carry around, and I don't have to squeeze all the colors out every time. But if you're working on a big surface, you might find tubes much easier to use because with pens, it usually takes a long time to pick up the colors and you can only pick up a certain quantity of paint each time. So that could be a downside because as we know that timing is very important in watercolor painting. Second is paper. Paper is almost as important as paints because only with the right paper can you achieve a beautiful result. First of all, you might want to put aside your drawing paper or writing paper or even copy paper because they're not designed for watercolor. So you won't be able to do certain effects and techniques. When you're out there looking for paper, just make sure that it says watercolor on the cover. You can choose to buy 400, 300, or 200 GSM. The heavier the paper is, the less likely it's going to curl. You can get cold press or hot press or even rough. That's like the different texture of the surface. I personally prefer 300 GSM cold pressed. Some papers are 100% cellulose, some are made with a certain percentage of cotton content, kind of a mixed paper, and others are purely cotton papers. For me, cotton paper is my favorite. They have a greater ability of absorbing water and keeping the moisture, and can usually take some reworking and several layers of paint, and the color seems to mix better and more natural on it, but they're usually very expensive. In the beginning, I mostly painted on cellulose paper because of their low price. They actually made very good practice paper, but sometimes I do get a little frustrated with it because the paper doesn't always take the paint and the water very well, so I tend to get more unwanted watermarks with it. Maybe a good compromise is the mixed paper, like the Fabriano watercolor paper. They are a little easier to paint on than the cellulose paper, I guess. I haven't tried it yet. Just because I prefer the cotton paper doesn't mean that I think one is necessarily better than the others. I guess it depends more on your style. Like, sometimes cellulose paper can make certain effects that cotton papers can't. So if your budget is limited, feel free to start with the cellulose paper 100% or with cotton content in it. But I would also recommend that you try the cotton paper. You don't have to get like a whole pad or block. You can just get single sheets. It's less expensive because I think it's nice to at least try different types of paper. You might not like it at all or instantly fall in love with it. There are brushes specifically designed for watercolors, and that's the kind of brush that you want to use. Acrylic brushes might be able to do the job sometimes, but not as well. And oil brush is not suitable for watercolors. For example, this is an oil brush. I don't do oil paintings, I just bought it to like put glues on paper or something like that. You can see how hard the bristles are compared to a watercolor brush. Although some artists do use it to do certain effects. Watercolor brushes are made of either animal hair or synthetic fibers. Animal hair is much softer and holds more water, so depending on I guess how comfortable you are with them, you can get either one or both. There's the round brush, which is the most versatile one. So it's better to have at least one or two in different sizes in the beginning. And there's the flat brush, which creates like even washes. It may or may not be necessary depending on what and how you paint, so it's up to you if you want to get it or not. And then you have the rigger brush for details. You can also get one or two of this. Again, brands don't really matter to me as long as it's real watercolor brush. I have Winsor & Newton, Isabey, Raphael, Sennelier, and a Chinese calligraphy brush. Some other tools that you'll need include a palette for mixing colors. You can get it in plastic, ceramic, or metal. If you have a metal palette, just make sure that you always dry it, otherwise it's going to rust. Normally, if you buy a watercolor set, it usually comes with the palette. Water containers. It's better to prepare two, one for clean water and the other to rinse your brush. It doesn't matter if it's plastic or glass, just make sure it's clean. Some paper towel or sponge or a cotton rag. This is to absorb excessive paint and water. Watercolor tape is to tape the paper down to, for example, a painting board so that you don't go all the way to the edges, and it also helps the paper from curling or buckling. And of course some pencils and erasers. So those are the things that I consider basic and necessary for beginners. There are, of course, more tools that can be very helpful, like a spray bottle, a painting board, masking fluid, etc. So you'll see for yourself and decide what you want to get later on. Now I'm going to show you some basic painting techniques. And when I say basic, I really mean it. These are very simple techniques, but they are pretty much all I use to paint. A controlled wash is a simple flat wash. It's basically to paint a certain shape or paint around an area you want to leave white. It might look easy, but is not always easy to achieve. A variegated wash is to mix and blend in two colors or more colors together without showing a clear edge or line where they meet. This can be a little tricky to do because of the way the water moves, and the best result is on cotton paper or when the paper is wet. So the key is to keep the two washes on the same level of wetness, because when one is wetter than the other, the water will just push the pigments towards the drier side, creating some kind of water rain effect. A graded wash is a wash that shows a gradual change in color value and intensity. So you start by a simple wash and dip a part of your brush in the water jar, remove excessive water, and do a second wash. This should be lighter than the first wash. And continue this by washing off some paints each time until you reach a wash that's light enough or transparent. Softening edges is to use clear water to make the hard edge disappear. Again, you want to load just enough water to do the softening and touch only the edge of the wash. Too much water will make the paint run wildly. Wet into wet is to paint on wet paper surface. So you pre-wet the paper with clean water and wait a little bit for it to be absorbed by the paper and start laying down the paints. The result can be different depending on how wet the paper is. To lift or blot is to take certain amount of paint off to create a lighter area. You can do this by using a brush or a paper towel. If you want to get the best result, do it while the wash is still wet. Because when the wash dries off, it will become more difficult to lift the colors out. Scumbling is kind of like a dry wash. It's used to create a broken effect or a rough texture. So load very little water, pick up the color, and use the belly of the brush to sweep across the paper surface. And this is what it looks like. You can also use the brush to splatter paint on the paper surface. Take a loaded brush and you can use either a dry brush or just your finger and tap your brush to splatter paint. Blooming effect might be a nightmare for some people, but I think it can also be very interesting, especially in flower painting. All you need to do is to put a clean water drop onto the onto the wash, because the water would just push the pigments to form this ring blooming thing. So if you don't want it to happen, you can avoid it by controlling or cutting down the amount of water in your brush. One thing I always tell myself is that watercolor is a very free and spontaneous media. It's not always about controlling things in your painting. Sometimes you just have to let the water do the work. And it might not always look neat, but that's part of the beauty. And you just need to learn to be okay with it. So I'm going to do a demonstration painting of lilies. The size is relatively small so that you can see both my palette and my painting. I am going to show you all the techniques that I talked about before. They might not be all necessary for this particular painting, but I am going to try my best to use all of them. And I'm using the cotton paper of Arches and a palette of Van Gogh. Normally I would choose to, every time I do a flower painting, I would normally go to my Cinelli palette because they have a really beautiful selection of red colors. But just since this is a beginner's video, I decided to use a more beginner-friendly paint. So the Van Gogh paint is a student's quality paint. And I have done a little pre-sketch painting. It's not even a painting, it's really small, just to see which colors I want to use and to see if they look okay for this painting. And as for the brush, I am going to use, as always, my round brush from Raphael, and this is a size 0, but as you can see that it's actually quite big, because if you, for example, if you take a Winsor & Newton Cotman brush, this one is a number 9 brush, you can see that it's actually smaller than the 0 brush. So yeah, I'm not really sure about the size of each brands. They seem to differ depending on different brands. So I would normally get a size that feels most comfortable in my hand. So I've already done the sketch in pencil, and I will put a reference photo right here. So I hope you enjoyed it. If there's anything I forgot to mention, or if you have any questions, just leave me a comment below. Again, thank you very much for watching. I will see you very soon. Bye!